Hey guys, I'm Apples and Dragons. This is Grey Sheep and Hedge Wizards, episode 14, I guess. And today's topic is going to be the Night of the Laughing Tree, part 5. So let me light our glass candles and I'll get the book and we'll get started. Look at that, ice and fire colors. Red and blue. If ice can burn, then love and hate can make. That was Jojen Reed. Alright, let's see. I forgot the book. I'm going to need this. A Storm of S Words by George R. R. Martin. I left off on page 282. So the Crannogman says his prayer. By the lake shore, looking across to the Isle of Faces. Prayer to the old gods of North and Neck. You never heard this tale from your father? Asked Jojen. It was old Nan who told the stories. Mira, go on. You can't stop there. Hodor must have felt the same. Hodor, he said, and then, Hodor, 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 Hodor. Well, said Mira, if you would hear the rest. Yes, tell it. 5 days of jousting were planned, she said. There was a great 7-sided melee as well, and archery and axe throwing, a horse race and tourney of singers. Never mind about all that. Bran squirmed impatiently in his basket on Hodor's back. Tell about the jousting. As my prince commands. The daughter of the castle was the Queen of Love and Beauty, with 4 brothers and an uncle to defend her. But all 4 sons of Harrenhal were defeated on the first day. Their conquerors reigned briefly as champions, until they were vanquished in turn. As it happened, the end of the first day saw the Porcupine Knight win a place among the champions, and on the morning of the second day the Pitchfork Knight and the Knight of the Two Towers were victorious as well. But late on the afternoon of that second day, as the shadows grew long, a mystery knight appeared in the lists. Bran nodded sagely. Mystery knights would oft appear at tourneys, with helms concealing their faces, and shields that were either blank or bore some strange device. Sometimes they were famous champions in disguise. The Dragon Knight once won a tourney as the Knight of Tears, so he could name his sister the Queen of Love and Beauty, in place of the king's mistress. And Barristan the Bold twice donned Mystery Knight's armor, the first time when he was only 10. It was the little Crannogman, I bet. No one knew, said Mira. But the Mystery Knight was short of stature, and clad in ill-fitting armor made up of bits and pieces. The device upon his shield was a heart tree of the old gods, a white weirwood with a laughing red face. Maybe he came from the Isle of Faces, said Bran. Was he green? In Old Nan's stories, the Guardians had dark green skin and leaves instead of hair. Sometimes they had antlers, too, but Bran didn't see how the Mystery Knight could have worn a helm if he had antlers. I bet the old gods sent him. Perhaps they did. The Mystery Knight dipped his lance before the king and rode to the end of the lists, where the 5 champions had their pavilions. You know the 3 he challenged. The Porcupine Knight, the Pitchfork Knight, and the Knight of the Twin Towers. Bran had heard enough of stories to know that. He was the little Crannogman, I told you. Whoever he was, the old gods gave strength to his arm. The Porcupine Knight fell first, then the Pitchfork Knight, and lastly the Knight of the Two Towers. None were well loved, so the common folk cheered lustily for the Knight of the Laughing Tree, as the new champion soon was called. When his fallen foes sought to ransom horse and armor, the Knight of the Laughing Tree spoke in a booming voice through his helm, saying, Teach your squires honor, that shall be ransom enough. Once the defeated knights chastised their squires sharply, their horses and armor were returned, and so the little Crannogman's prayer was answered. By the green men, or the old gods, or the children of the forest, who can say? It was a good story, Bran decided, after thinking about it a moment or two. Then what happened? Did the Knight of the Laughing Tree win the tourney and marry a princess? No, said Mira. That night at the great castle, the Storm Lord and the Knight of Skulls and Kisses each swore they would unmask him, and the king himself urged men to challenge him, declaring that the face behind that helm was no friend of his. But the next morning, when the heralds blew their trumpets and the king took his seat, only 2 champions appeared. The Knight of the Laughing Tree had vanished. The king was wroth, and even sent his son the Dragon Prince to seek the man, but all they ever found was his painted shield, hanging abandoned in a tree. It was the Dragon Prince who won that tourney in the end. Oh, Bran thought about the tale a while. That was a good story, but it should have been the 3 bad knights who hurt him, not their squires. Then the little Crannogman could have killed them all. The part about the ransoms was stupid, and the Mystery Knight should win the tourney, defeating every challenger, and name the Wolf Maid the Queen of Love and Beauty. She was, said Mira, but that's a sadder story. Chills, man, chills. All right. Are you certain you've never heard this tale before, Bran? Asked Jojen. Your Lord Father never told it to you? Bran shook his head. The day was growing old by then, and long shadows were creeping down the mountainsides to send black fingers through the pines. If the little Crannogman could visit the Isle of Faces, maybe I could too. All the tales agreed that the green men had strange magic powers. Maybe they could help him walk again, even turn him into a knight. They turned the little Crannogman into a knight, even if it was only for a day, he thought. A day would be enough. Amazing. Where do I even begin? We're in the thick of it now. I had some notes. Yes, let me address some things I didn't finish saying last time. I said that readers argue about whether or not it was possible for the Quiet Wolf to have overheard the Crannogman's prayer. And one theory about who the Knight of the Laughing Tree was is that it was the Quiet Wolf, Ned, who overheard the Crannogman's prayer and then decided to fulfill it. The prayer presumably being that some champion would show up to joust on his behalf in order to get revenge on the knights of the squires who beat him up. And I said that it's a weird plan, because it's an indirect sort of revenge. The knights aren't the ones who beat up the Crannogman, the squires are. And defeating the knights is a pretty feeble revenge against the squires, as far as revenges go. And considering how badly the Crannogman was beaten up, he was bruised and bloodied. I don't think it was possible for the Quiet Wolf, Ned, to have overheard the Crannogman's prayer, because it says he knelt on the lake shore. It says the Quiet Wolf had offered the little Crannogman a place in his tent that night, but before he slept, he knelt on the lake shore, looking across the water, blah, blah, blah. So the Crannogman said the prayer kneeling on the lake shore, and you don't really put a tent that close to the lake. And it doesn't say that the Quiet Wolf was there with him. And also, I don't think it would have been necessary for the Quiet Wolf to have overheard the prayer, because the Quiet Wolf has already met the Crannogman, and he's aware of what happened to him, that he was beaten up by 3 squires and all that. So the Quiet Wolf already has enough information to know that the Crannogman probably wants revenge, especially since the Crannogman and the Starks already had a conversation about how he might get revenge by jousting, and Benjen offered to find armor and stuff for him. So the Quiet Wolf already knows about what happened to the Crannogman, and that he would want revenge. There's no need for him to have overheard the prayer. That's just a little argument that likes to creep up in Knight of the Laughing Tree discussions sometimes that I wanted to address. After Mira says that the Crannogman says his prayer, Jojen interrupts the story. He says, "You never heard this tale from your father?" This comes up at the beginning of the story, in the middle of it, and I think again at the end. Your Lord Father never told it to you? That's Jojen again. Are you certain you never heard this tale before, Bran? Asked Jojen. Your Lord Father never told it to you? So at least 3 times. The Reeds express surprise that Bran hasn't heard this story from his father before. I think it suggests that the Reeds heard it from their own father, Howland Reed. And I think that's right, that Howland probably told them this story many times. And that's why they can remember it and they know it well. And according to Jojen's comment, or not, they already have some ideas about who the Mystery Knight is or isn't. It was Old Nan who told the stories. Mira, go on. You can't stop there. So Bran's trying to get Mira to continue the story, and he's eager to hear the rest of it. Hodor must have felt the same. Hodor, he said, and then Hodor, 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 Hodor. Hodor wants to hear the rest of the story too. Well, said Mira, if you would hear the rest. Yes, tell it. And then Mira starts telling the story again. She says 5 days of jousting were planned, she said. There was a great 7-sided melee as well, and archery, and axe throwing, a horse race, and tourney of singers, ... And Bran interrupts. Never mind about all that. Bran squirmed impatiently in his basket on Hodor's back. Tell about the jousting. As my prince commands. And then Bran interrupts her again and rushes her to the part of the story that he's interested in. That whole back and forth between Jojen, Bran, and Mira that interrupted the Tourney at Harrenhal's story, Mira's telling of it, constitutes 5 to 7 paragraphs, depending on how you count it. There's an interruption to the story here, in which Bran is rushing Mira past what Bran seems to think is unnecessary filler, involving a great 7-sided melee, archery, axe throwing, a horse race, and a tourney of singers. And it might be worthwhile to stop and consider what likely happened in those other tourneys, and who likely competed, and who maybe likely won, and all that. Like, we learn in a very late Eddard chapter that Robert competed in the melee. And you can imagine that maybe Lyanna competed in the horse race, and maybe she did very well, because she's said to have been a good horse rider. I haven't dug much into those possibilities yet, but you could. And I suspect that there's some interesting stuff to find in it. But for now, we're going to label it unnecessary filler, because this is Bran's POV, and that's how he perceives it. He wants to know about the jousting. He says, tell about the jousting. I want to pause here and talk about some of the more esoteric things that are going on in the story so far. The way that the characters in the story are engaging with the Tourney at Harrenhal's story has mirrored the reader's engagement with it in a number of ways already. For example, Mira Reed becoming progressively more relaxed about giving away the real identities of the symbolic names in the story mirrors the fact that, for the reader, the symbolic names are the first and easiest layer of mystery to penetrate with the Tourney of Harrenhal's story. Likewise, it's also the first and easiest layer of mystery for Bran to penetrate in the Tourney of Harrenhal's story. And Bran can be symbolic of George R. R. Martin's audience, because Bran is Mira's audience, and Mira and George R. R. Martin are both the storytellers. So Bran can represent the reading audience, and Mira can represent the author. Here's another example. The Reeds seeing knights as invaders rather than heroes mirrors the fact that the Knight of the Laughing Tree steals the reader's attention from the Crannogman in Mira's telling of the Tourney at Harrenhal's story. Here's another one. Bran saying that old Nan said that old stories are like old friends, she used to say. You have to visit them from time to time. Can be read as a symbolic acknowledgement that the reader has to revisit this Knight of the Laughing Tree story from time to time in order to work out A Song of Ice and Fire's most difficult mysteries. So Mira's telling of the Tourney at Harrenhal's story is representing the reader's relationship to the Tourney at Harrenhal's story in all sorts of ways. The more ways you become aware of, the more you can feel the story's and the author's awareness of you, and the story's awareness of itself as a story. a thing that's both real and not real, depending on what you mean by real, and whose function is always and ultimately to show the reader his own reflection, which is something I talked about when I read that passage from Shakespeare's Hamlet in a previous episode. And you may remember from my Song of Ice and Fire episode that this is the same feeling that I said we're going to feel when we finally understand the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy. It's a sense that, up until now, the story has been shrouded in a fog of mysticism, and now you can finally see the story's true nature, the role it's filling for you, your society, and the era that you live in. So the recognition that Mira's telling of the Tourney at Harrenhal story is symbolically representing the reader's relationship to the Tourney at Harrenhal story should indicate to us that we're brushing up against something like universal understanding of A Song of Ice and Fire's essential mysteries. And if symbolically representing the reader's relationship to the story is how A Song of Ice and Fire broadcasts its awareness of itself and the reader in Mira's telling of the Tourney at Harrenhal story, then maybe it's also how A Song of Ice and Fire will broadcast its awareness of itself and the reader in the A Song of Ice and Fire story. Then I ask myself, how is the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy representing my relationship to A Song of Ice and Fire? That's the right question, but I'm 100 leagues ahead of myself. We have a lot to talk about before we get there. But consider it a teaser, I guess. Never mind about all that. Bran squirmed impatiently in his basket on Hodor's back. Tell about the jousting. Mira goes on to tell about the jousting. The daughter of the castle was the Queen of Love and Beauty, with 4 brothers and an uncle to defend her, but all 4 sons of Harrenhal were defeated on the first day. So the defending Queen of Love and Beauty's hope for retaining that title is completely smashed on the first day. I don't know what the significance of that is, if anything, but I suspect there is some. As it happened, the end of the first day saw the Porcupine Knight win a place among the champions, and on the morning of the second day, the Pitchfork Knight and the Knight of the 2 Towers were victorious as well. So the knights of the squires who beat up the Crannogman have distinguished themselves on the first and second day of the 5-day tournament. But late on the afternoon of that second day, as the shadows grew long, a mystery knight appeared in the lists. So the mystery knight appears, and Bran gives us some backstory on this whole mystery knight tradition. Mystery knights would oft appear at tourneys, with helms concealing their faces, and shields that were either blank or bore some strange device. Sometimes they were famous champions in disguise. The Dragon Knight once won a tourney as the Knight of Tears, so he could name his sister the Queen of Love and Beauty, in place of the King's mistress. And Barristan the Bold twice donned a Mystery Knight's armor, the first time when he was only 10. It was the little Crannogman, I bet. If you gather up a list of all of the Mystery Knights throughout history, you'll find that the Knight of the Laughing Tree is the only Mystery Knight whose identity remains unknown. As Bran says here, the Knight of Tears was Aemon the Dragon Knight, and some other Mystery Knight was Barristan the Bold. These 2 Mystery Knights, Aemon the Dragon Knight and Barristan the Bold, are they're not arbitrary selections by the author. Bran thinking of these 2 Mystery Knights, rather than any other Mystery Knights he could have thought of, symbolically represent the role of this entire Tourney at Harrenhal story in the A Song of Ice and Fire story. Through a mechanism that I've taken to calling labeling, or metatextual labeling. And a quick rundown of it goes like this. Aemon the Dragon Knight and Barristan the Bold have their own particular stories and backstories and histories and deeds and families and so on that altogether constitute their own themes. Aemon the Dragon Knight has his own theme. And Varys the Bold has his own theme. And it takes a lot of work to prove what those themes are. But if you can take my word for it for now, I'll just tell you what they are. The theme of Aemon the Dragon Knight is something like, history is written by the victor. Or maybe more specifically, history is written and passed down by those who survived. Because the entire history of that era that Aemon the Dragon Knight lived in, the reign of Aegon IV, is falsified and propagandized to whitewash Aemon the Dragon Knight and demonize Aegon IV. And the theme of Barristan the Bold is that he does around doing all these unbelievable, amazing, heroic things that nobody thought he could do. And in doing them, he inadvertently ruins a more important plan that was in play. And that probably would have been better for everyone had he not ruined that plan. So Barristan's a super competent, heroic figure, but it's an unhappy coincidence that so many of his noteworthy acts of heroism inadvertently ruined things for everyone. It's pretty funny, actually. And both of those themes, history is written by those who survived, and somebody doing something heroic and ruining things for everyone, represent this whole Tourney at Harrenhal story in very big ways that you'll understand before I'm finished with it. Because this whole Tourney at Harrenhal story, as told by Mira Reed, as told to her by Howland Reed, is a construct. It was specifically designed for a specific purpose by its in-story author. And I have to use the bathroom. I'll be right back. I'm back. I'm going to return back to the basics now. Let's identify the three knights. There's a Pitchfork Knight, a Porcupine Knight, and a Knight of Two Towers. First two are the easiest. The Pitchfork Knight can only be Leslyn Hay. The Porcupine Knight, I think, can only be Boros Blount. He's a Knight of the Kingsguard, of Joffrey's Kingsguard. Not as bad as Meryn Trant, but still not good. And the Knight of Two Towers, that's House Frey. That can be one of three Freys, and I don't know which one it is. It can be Ryman Frey, Hostine Frey, or Stevron Frey. And I think they're all interesting ones for it to be thematically. But I think Ryman is maybe the more interesting of the three. So my money's on Ryman. And it might be important to know who those knights were, so that we can compare the kind of person they are today to the kind of person they were. And if they're different, we can consider how much of that difference we might be able to credit to the Knight of the Laughing Tree's intervention, where he reprimanded the knights and reminded them of their duties to their squires. I haven't really gone further than that regarding the three knights, but it's on my imaginary to-do list. So the Mystery Knight appears as the shadows grew long on the second day. So it's at the end of the second day that the Mystery Knight appears in the list. So whoever the Knight of the Laughing Tree was, he or she had almost 2 days to prepare, to acquire his lance and armor and helmet and shield and get it painted with Laughing Tree. That's something else I need to talk about. The Laughing Tree. It's mirrored in Dunk and Egg. My memory is pretty fuzzy on Dunk and Egg, but basically what happens in Dunk and Egg is that Dunk needs to come up with a new sigil for himself. And so he takes his shield to get it painted by some lady. And he's describing what he wants his sigil to be, what he wants her to paint on it. And when he comes back later and gets his shield, it's not what he wanted. Everything about it looks wrong to him. All the parts are there that he ordered, but they're just slightly wrong in a way that annoys him. Like, I think he ordered a shooting star, and the star is falling, which you could see as a bad sign of, well, I don't want a star that's falling. I want to be a rising star or something, or a shooting star. I think there was an oak tree in it too. I don't remember. But anyway, that whole Dunk and Egg situation provides an explanation, a potential explanation, for why the tree on the Night of the Laughing Tree shield is laughing. Because maybe what happened was the Knight of the Laughing Tree ordered a painting of a tree with a face on it, but he forgot to specify what kind of face. And so the painter was like, well, I'll just put a happy face. And it came out looking like it was laughing. I'm almost certain that's what happened. And that's the point of that Dunk and Egg situation, is to inform the Night of the Laughing Tree situation. And then Mira gives us some identifying characteristics of the Mystery Knight. The Mystery Knight was short of stature and clad in ill-fitting armor made up of bits and pieces. The device upon his shield was a heart tree of the old gods, a white weirwood with a laughing red face. And these details are hotly debated in the readership because they're seemingly undisputable literal details. They're not circumstantial. If the character that you're proposing as the true identity of the Knight of the Laughing Tree was not short of stature, you won't be taken seriously. Your answer is completely dismissed by everyone. Short of stature was one of them. It's not going away. But there is some wiggle room in the interpretation. Because if you compile a list of all of the men who competed in this tourney, you can see that most of them are taller than average. They're characters like Brandon, Rhaegar, and Barristan, all of whom are taller than average. They're 6 feet or higher. So a person of average height, upside people of great height, would appear short of stature by comparison. In fact, even a person of slightly above average height, upside people who are greatly above average height, could appear short of stature by comparison. So the range of potential character heights for the Mystery Knight is actually greater than it first seemed to be. And clad in ill-fitting armor made up of bits and pieces. Maybe he came from the Isle of Faces, said Bran. Was he green? In Old Man's stories, the Guardians had dark green skin and leaves instead of hair. Sometimes they had antlers, too, but Bran didn't see how the Mystery Knight could have worn a helm if he had antlers. I bet the old gods sent him. So Bran's first idea for who the Mystery Knight is that it was a green man from the Isle of Faces, which is a reasonable idea, because the Knight of the Laughing Tree looked to the Isle of Faces before he said his prayer, and said a prayer to the old gods of North and Neck. And Bran's heard stories about the green men, the Isle of Faces, from Old Nan. And in those stories, they were guardians, and they had dark green skin and leaves instead of hair. Sometimes they had antlers too. But Bran didn't see how the Mystery Knight could have worn a helm if he had antlers. Bran discounts the possibility that it was a green man with antlers, which doesn't discount the possibility that it was a green man, because the phrase "sometimes they had antlers" also means that sometimes they didn't have antlers. But if that wasn't enough to help the reader discount the possibility that the Mystery Knight was a green man, the fact that Bran is providing us with that answer right away is enough to help us discount the possibility that it was a green man. Because otherwise, the character solved the mystery for us, and that would be pretty lame. Unless it's the one exception where our mistake was discarding the first answer the story provided us from the beginning. But most authors know better than to overuse that trick, because if they overuse it, we'll begin to expect it. So I feel mostly confident that the Knight of the Laughing Tree was probably not a green man. So I don't think it's a green man. I bet the old gods sent him. Perhaps they did. The Mystery Knight dipped his lance before the king and rode to the end of the lists, where the 5 champions had their pavilions. You know the 3 he challenged. So the Mystery Knight dipping his lance before the king and riding to the end of the lists shows that the Mystery Knight is familiar with tournament pageantry and what's expected of him. And that kind of runs against the possibility that the Mystery Knight was the Crannogman, Halvin Reed, because he's new to Westerosi culture. It's possible that Halvin Reed observed this behavior in the other knights from watching the tourney. But he also doesn't know how to joust, and so all of that unfamiliarity combined runs against the idea that the Crannogman was the Mystery Knight. You know the 3 he challenged: the Porcupine Knight, the Pitchfork Knight, and the Knight of Twin Towers. Bran had heard enough stories to know that. He was the little Crannogman, I told you. So Bran has made the connection between the Crannogman's prayer to the old gods of North and Neck and the Mystery Knight's mysterious emergence in the list. Because that is what the story clearly suggests the Crannogman prayed for. They said he wanted vengeance after all. And it's interesting to note that the Crannogman is actually the second most popular candidate, according to the audience, for who was the Knight of the Laughing Tree. The first most popular is Lyanna, by about 6 times the popularity of the Crannogman. So the gap between first place and second place candidates is massive, but it's still kind of interesting that the Crannogman is second place. Specifically because Bran offers that answer right from the start. It's his second answer after the Green Men. I noted last time that the Crannogman's motivations throughout this story they're mildly paradoxical. Wanting revenge suggests that he wants to seek out conflict, but needing to be convinced to go to the feast suggests that he wants to avoid conflict. He must be at least somewhat conflicted between those 2 motivations. So the real question is, what are the proportions? Does he mostly want to get revenge? Or does he mostly want to avoid conflict? And the answer to that question will determine what his motivation mostly is. The story says, much as he wished to have his vengeance. So the answer that Meera's telling of the Tourney of Harrenhal's story provides us about the Crannogman's motivations is that he mostly wants vengeance. But let's consider the alternative for a moment. Let's consider that the Crannogman mostly wants to avoid conflict. And while some part of him does want vengeance, it's a smaller part that he's mostly succeeding in suppressing, and maybe he's even on the path of forgiveness to the squires for beating him up. He'd have to be a pretty good guy to be so forgiving. But he did just come back from a visit to the Isle of Faces, which sounds like a pretty peaceful place, where he studied magic with the Green Men and got right with the old gods. So the forgiving Crannogman interpretation is viable. If the Crannogman had given up his desire for revenge, and if he was on the path to forgiving the squires, then the story's implicit suggestion that the Crannogman's prayer was about the Mystery Knight and getting a champion to avenge him doesn't work anymore. We need a new explanation for what the Crannogman prayed for. Because the Crannogman who's set aside vengeance wouldn't have prayed for that. I'm going to put a pin in the analysis here and come back to it next time. The pen says approximately that if the Crannogman has set aside his desire for vengeance and has taken a more forgiving or move on from it attitude about the squires beating him up, then it doesn't make sense that he prayed for a champion to avenge him in the joust, and we need a new explanation for what the Crannogman prayed for. When his fallen foes sought to ransom horse and armor, the Knight of the Laughing Tree spoke in a booming voice through his helm, saying, "Teach your squire honor. That shall be ransom enough." What a nice guy. He gave their armor and horses back, which might seem like not a big deal, but horses and armor are very expensive in this world. There are some lords who can't even afford armor for their sons. I think that was at Sisterton, the Sisterton lord. Granted, they're some of the poorest lords in the kingdom, but lords nevertheless. And so the little Crannogman's prayer was answered. By the green men, or the old gods, or the children of the forest, who can say? Mira explicitly tells us that the Crannogman's prayer was answered when the Mystery Knight defeated the 3 knights of the 3 squires who beat up the Crannogman. Or does it? And so the little Crannogman's prayer was answered. ... And so the little Crannogman's prayer was answered. ... So what do you think? Do the words "and so" explicitly tell us that the Crannogman's prayer was for a Mystery Knight to joust on his behalf? Or do the words "and so" only suggest that the Crannogman's prayer was for a Mystery Knight to joust on his behalf? It seems open to interpretation, to me anyway. If it's explicitly saying that the Crannogman prayed for a champion to joust on his behalf, then that settles the matter of what the Crannogman prayed for. But if the words "and so" are only suggesting, perhaps more strongly than before, that what the Crannogman prayed for was for a champion to joust on his behalf, then the matter of what the Crannogman prayed for is not necessarily resolved. It was a good story, Bran decided after thinking about it a moment or two. Then what happened? Did the Knight of the Laughing Tree win the tourney and marry a princess? No, said Mira. So Bran's kind of expecting that the hero of the story wins the girl, which lines up with the Queen of Love and Beauty tradition of tournaments, where the hero of the tournament wins the girl, basically. He crowns her, and then it's up to her whether or not she's going to give herself to him, but she almost always does, if not always does, allowing that love can mean not only romantic love, but also familial or platonic kinds of love. Did the Knight of the Laughing Tree win the tourney and marry a princess? No, said Mira. That night at the great castle, the Storm Lord and the Knight of Skulls and Kisses each swore they would unmask him, and the king himself urged men to challenge him, declaring that the face behind that helm was no friend of his. The Storm Lord is Robert Baratheon, and the Knight of Skulls and Kisses is Richard Lonmouth. And House Lonmouth is a vassal house of House Baratheon. They're both in the Stormlands. So Robert and Richard probably know each other, which was probably why they were having a drinking contest together. It's kind of cool. Robert's got a friend who isn't Ned. Nothing against Ned, though. And they both swore that they would unmask the Mystery Knight, which you can imagine need not require that they're doing it on the demands of the king. Robert is just the kind of guy who's like going to take the Mystery Knight's hidden identity as a challenge, because the rule of Mystery Knights is that you don't get to unmask them until and unless you defeat them in the joust. So Robert sees this knight succeeding in the joust and winning the day and becoming very popular with the commons. And you can see how he would look at the Mystery Knight as somebody he wants to take a whack at. Give me a try. I bet I can beat him. So Robert and Richard Longmouth swear to unmask him. And the king himself, Aerys the Mad King, urged men to challenge him, declaring that the face behind that helm was no friend of his. So this line is a grappling point for readers who have successfully sussed out the theme of Aerys Targaryen. This is another thing that you probably won't believe without me having to prove it, do a lot of work to prove it to you. But the theme of Aerys Targaryen is that the histories demonize him. And he was actually somewhere between a mediocre king and a good king. Before everything started going to shit, of course. A Song of Ice and Fire's most fundamental challenge to the reader is to put yourself in the shoes of the characters so that you can see things from their perspective and the way they see it, in order to develop your understanding of the dilemma at hand, and then be able to solve it justly. So it's a story very much about moral psychology. Human beings have a tendency to see the world in terms of good and evil. We moralize things. And once that good versus evil psychology takes hold within a person, it's very difficult to get that person to be able to see the situation objectively again. And that's what's going on with the Mad King. The characters and the story and even the fake histories have drilled it into our minds over and over repeatedly that this is the Mad King. He's evil. He's the Hitlerian figure of the story. And it began being drilled into us before we actually knew the whole facts of the situation surrounding Aerys and Robert's rebellion and all of the politics happening between the dozens, if not hundreds, of characters involved. Anyway, so the Aerys Targaryen puzzle, or the Targaryen madness puzzle, whatever you want to call it, is works kind of like this. When you set aside your good and evil psychology and you look at the situation objectively, at what people are doing, most, if not all, of the things that we're led to believe were indicative of Aerys' madness and evilness were actually very reasonable and sound judgment calls that many of them actually worked out very well for King Aerys, even though he died in the end. Here's an example. In the world of Ice and Fire, Maester Yandel depicts the Mad King as though he decided to name Tywin's son and heir Jaime to the Kingsguard specifically to annoy Tywin, to steal him of his heir, and leave him with the stunted dwarf Tyrion as an heir. And then at the tourney at Harrenhal, when Jaime's actually being knighted and sworn into the Kingsguard, the histories depict Aerys as though he suddenly realized how stupid this was because he's putting his enemy Tywin's son and heir beside him day and night, armed with a sword. So the telling of this part of history clearly depicts Aerys as a crazy lunatic who's just wish-washing from one bad idea to the next and stumbling over his own resentments and contempt for Tywin and just people around him and his suspiciousness of everybody. But that narrative is completely discredited retroactively by accounts we get from other characters. For example, Jaime becoming a Knight of the Kingsguard was not actually Aerys' idea. There's a Cersei chapter where Cersei remembers convincing Jaime to join the Kingsguard specifically so that he can stay near Cersei and continue having sex with her. And then Cersei said, "I'll do the rest." So presumably Cersei went to Aerys or whoever she needed to at court to convince Aerys to invite Jaime to join the Kingsguard. So Jaime joining the Kingsguard was actually Cersei's idea, and Jaime agreed to it in private before the idea was ever brought to Aerys. So it completely destroys the implicit narrative in the world of Ice and Fire that Aerys was just This was Eris's idea, and he was doing it specifically to annoy Tywin and steal him of his heir. So that was a long tangent, but I think it was necessary, because it's going to sound like a pretty radical claim to say that the Mad King actually wasn't so bad. But that is the theme of the Mad King. And once you take that theme and you utilize it and you apply it to this Tourney of Harrenhal's story to try to make some educated guesses about who the Knight of the Laughing Tree really was and what's really going on in it at any given part. This line where Eris urged men to challenge him, declaring that the face behind that helm was no friend of his, introduces a big opportunity for dramatic comedic irony. Because a funny way for that line to resolve in the end is if the face behind that helm was actually a friend of his. Because Eris being the Mad King and evil and wrong in every way, this would align with that. He's wrong that the face behind that helm was no friend of his. It actually was his friend. Maybe it was even someone closer than a friend. Maybe it was his son, Rhaegar Targaryen. So when a reader tells me that he thinks the Knight of the Laughing Tree was Rhaegar Targaryen, that tells me that that reader has a good eye for dramatic irony, but that he hasn't figured out the theme of Aerys Targaryen yet. When you apply the theme of Aerys Targaryen, that actually his judgment was more sound than we're led to believe. The more dramatically ironic resolution to that line, the face behind that helm was no friend of his, is that Aerys was actually right. And that whoever the Knight of the Laughing Tree turns out to be, it would thematically resonate best if it turns out to be somebody who is a profound sort of enemy to Aerys Targaryen. But the next morning, when the heralds blew their trumpets and the king took his seat, only 2 champions appeared. The Knight of the Laughing Tree had vanished. The king was wroth, and even sent his son, the Dragon Prince, to seek the man, but all they ever found was his painted shield, hanging abandoned in a tree. It was the Dragon Prince who won that tourney in the end. That's a very mysterious disappearance, which could have magical implications which tie into maybe it was a green man who was the Mystery Knight. And in the R+L=J interpretation of this story, when the king sent Rhaegar to seek the man, he found her in the forest, taking off her armor and shield and all that, and realized it was a girl, and fell in love with her, partly for her beauty and partly for her moral fiber, let's say. And then that was why he crowned her the Queen of Love and Beauty, because he sort of fell in love with her and her good character. But that's the biggest mystery of the Tourney of Harrenhal in the year of the false spring. What really happened with Rhaegar and Lyanna? Oh, Bran thought about the tale a while. That was a good story, but it should have been the 3 bad knights who hurt him, not their squires. Then the little Crannogman could have killed them all. The part about the ransoms was stupid, and the Mystery Knight should win the tourney, defeating every challenger, and name the Wolf Maid the Queen of Love and Beauty. She was, said Mira, but that's a sadder story. Bran is suggesting changes to the story that he thinks would make it a better story. And in a previous episode, I said that the more important split in the interpretation of the Knight of the Laughing Tree is regarding his or her motivations, not his or her identity. And regarding his motivations, the interpretation splits between the Knight of the Laughing Tree was trying to avenge the Crannogman, and the Knight of the Laughing Tree was trying to fix the situation between the squires and the knights. Or maybe to repair the institution and tradition of knighthood itself, in whatever small way he can. Or maybe to repair society in whatever small way he can. Because Westerosi society, since the Andal invasion, is based on and centered around knighthood. And if the Knight of the Laughing Tree's motivation was to avenge the Crannogman, then Bran's changes to the story are right. They're good. He says, but it should have been the 3 bad knights who hurt them, not their squires. So that change to the story would sort of remove the middleman between the evildoers and the victim, where it's just the knights who are beating up the Crannogman, not their squires. Which you can see also kind of fixes the Crannogman's plan for revenge being pretty feeble, to defeat the knights of the squires rather than to defeat the squires or beat them up back or something. Then the little Crannogman could have killed them all. Certainly killing someone is a more extreme sort of revenge than just defeating them in a joust. So if the Knight of the Laughing Tree's motivation was to avenge the Crannogman, certainly killing them would have been a more extreme revenge. He says the part about the ransoms was stupid. It seems like Bran thinks that whole ransom part was unnecessary and stupid. Who cares about some horses in armor? And the Mystery Knight should win the tourney, defeating every challenger, and name the Wolf Maid the Queen of Love and Beauty. And Bran thinks that at the end of it all, the Mystery Knight should win the whole tournament, which is obviously better than just defeating 3 crappy knights. And defeat every challenger, and then name the Wolf Maid the Queen of Love and Beauty. In other words, Bran thinks that after the Mystery Knight avenges the Crannogman and kills the 3 bad knights, he should win everything at the end. The tournament, the fame, and the girl. And name the Wolf Maid the Queen of Love and Beauty. She was, said Mira, but that's a sadder story. Now let's look at Bran's changes to the story through the lens of the Knight of the Laughing Tree's motivation was to fix the situation between the squires and the knights. He says, but it should have been the 3 bad knights who hurt him, not their squires. Immediately, Bran demonstrates a severe misunderstanding of the story's deeper meanings. By taking the squires out of the story and having just the knights beat up the Crannogman, there can be no relationship between the squires and knights for the Knight of the Laughing Tree to repair. So that change to the story would completely ruin the story if the Knight of the Laughing Tree's fundamental motivation is to repair the relationship between the squires and the knights. He says, then the little Crannogman could have killed them all. Again, Bran demonstrates that he completely missed the point of the story. The relationship between the knights and squires can't be repaired if the knights are killed. The part about the ransoms was stupid. Bran doesn't even notice that by returning the knights' horses in armor on the condition that they teach their squires honor, the Mystery Knight is creating the incentive that the knights need to do their duty to their squires. And Bran doesn't seem to notice that the knight's purpose in defeating these 3 knights to begin with was specifically to acquire their horses in armor, specifically so that he can use them to incentivize the knights to teach their squires honor. Bran says, and the Mystery Knight should win the tourney, defeating every challenger. Bran doesn't want the Mystery Knight to leave after he kills the 3 knights. He wants him to stick around and defeat everyone, and name the Wolf Maid the Queen of Love and Beauty as a reward for rescuing the Crannogman, and ostensibly fall in love with the Wolf Maid. So in the interpretation that the Knight of the Laughing Tree's motivation was to avenge the Crannogman, Bran's changes to the story are good and right, and that's the end of it. But in the interpretation that the Knight of the Laughing Tree's motivation was to fix the situation between the squires and the knights, Bran is missing the deeper meanings of the story. And Mira is neglecting to tell Bran that he's missing the deeper meanings of the story. She was, said Mira, but that's a sadder story. Mira's last comment, in relationship to the theme of Bran's comments, that Bran is missing the deeper meanings of the story. A Song of Ice and Fire gives us the quietest whisper of suggestion that there is some hidden relationship between the Dragon Prince naming the Wolf Maid the Queen of Love and Beauty and missing the deeper meanings of the story. And that's where I'm going to end today. As always, it was a blast. I'll see you next time.